Well, good morning. Morning, church family. How you doing? Man, I miss you. I miss us being together, but glad we can do this at least. I do have something to tell you. Next week, we are going to be having a second church at home time. So in addition to 10:30, we're going to do 9 o'clock a.m. So you've got two opportunities to join us, to be with us, worship with us, 9 a.m. and 10:30 starting next week, right? So hope you're doing good. Hope your family's all right. I was driving home the other day, and in my neighborhood, there's a place where the walking trail crosses the road. And as I kind of drove up there in my car, I noticed this family standing there, and it was a mom and a dad and two kids. And they were standing there, and they kind of looked like, literally and figuratively, they were at a crossroads. And Dad and the kids were all geared up, and they're like ready to go this way, right? They're ready to go. But Mom, you could tell there was some tension happening, right? Because Mom was pointing the other direction. And she had a look on her face that was like, I'm going in a new direction. I'm out. I'm going this way, right? And I thought, I wonder how many of us are feeling that way. Oh, not going in a different direction maybe from our families, but that feeling of I'm just ready for a new direction. Man, I'm ready for something new, something different. Or maybe it's just that feeling of I'd like to know what's happening, what's going to happen, what's my future going to be like, right? Well, today as we continue our Promise Keeper series, we've come to the part in the story of Joseph where Joseph is actually going to confront his brothers. The 10 brothers who sold him into slavery 20 years earlier, they're actually going to meet up again today and talk about a family in need of a new direction. Well, God's going to be in this story. He's going to have something for them, and I believe He's going to have something for you too. So join me as we dive into this story. We've been talking for a couple of weeks about famine. The famine sort of dominates the story at this time, right? The famine is the reason that Joseph has ascended in power in the Egyptian empire. He's now the number 2 guy. He rules the whole land because he came up with a plan to make sure that the empire survived and thrived through a 7-year famine. In the rest of the world, people are starving. And so off in the land of Canaan, where Joseph's family lives, they're starving. And driven by their desperation, they hear that there's food in Egypt. And so these 10 brothers, they travel to Egypt to buy food. They have no idea that the person you buy food from in Egypt is their brother Joseph. And so you can only imagine the scene as they walk into that palace and Joseph sees them. We're in chapter 42 in the book of Genesis. I'm going to call out some of the key verses just so you can see the story, how it moves along. This is verse 7. Look at this. It says, as soon as Joseph saw his brothers, he recognized them, but he pretended to be a stranger and he spoke harshly to them. That verse says so much. Joseph was 17 when his brothers sold him off. And now he's full grown and he's an Egyptian lord, so they don't recognize him, but he sees them all the way. And he deceives them, right? He doesn't reveal who he is. He holds his cards back, so to speak, and he treats them harshly. In fact, if you read the story, he goes on and he tells them that they're spies. He accuses them of spying in the land, and they're like, hey, we're just a family from Canaan. He's like, nope, you guys are spies. And he throws them in jail. He throws them in jail. You see, the tables have turned, right? Because now Joseph has all the power. And what we're going to see in this story is Joseph using that power to turn the tables and to get his revenge on his brothers. Because what he does finally is he puts them all in jail and he says, all right, I'll tell you what, I'll let you go. I'll give you a chance to prove that you're not lying, that you're not spies. I'll send you home, but I'm going to keep one of you here with me in jail. And you go home, and you told me you had a younger brother still at home, so you go home and you get that brother. and you bring him back here, then I'll let your other brother go. You see, he's using his power. He's turning the tables on them. He's actually doing to them kind of what they did to him. I'm going to throw one of you in a pit, and I'm going to send the rest of you away, and I'm going to see if you'll come back for him. I'm going to make you explain this to your father. And the brothers, for their part, they're locked into this guilt. They, again, have no idea this is Joseph, but they recognize that this situation, it must have something to do with what they did so many years ago. And so this is one of the things they say in verse 21. They said to one another, "Surely we're being punished because of our brother. We saw how distressed he was when he pleaded with us for his life, but we would not listen. That's why this distress has come upon us." Right? They recognize they're in trouble. Right? The ruler of Egypt has them in jail. He's holding their lives in his hand. And they recognize this must have something to do with our guilt, the 20-year-long guilt trip they've been on because of what they did to their brother Joseph. And the world they live in, the place where they're stuck, is one of guilt and retribution. Right? That's all they can see. You either hide your guilt or you pay back for your guilt if it gets discovered. And so that's what they're thinking as this unveils. And it's so amazing just to see this family operate. Right? This is how this family works. Those with power use it to their advantage. Revenge is a thing. Deception is normal. That's what these brothers did. Remember when Joseph was 17, that's how our story began. He got sold by his brothers into slavery. They were jealous of him because he said, "Hey, I had a dream. Guess what? One day you're going to bow down to me." And they said, "Oh yeah, you'll bow down. We'll bow down to you." Never. And off he goes to Egypt as a slave. And then they go home and they lie. They deceive their family and say, "We don't know what happened to him. He must be dead, and an animal must have eaten him." And so they've lived this way now in this family for 20 years. That's just how they roll. And now when Joseph gets the chance, he's using his power to make their lives hard. He's going to get his way, and he's lying and he's deceiving them all along. They're stuck. Does that sound familiar to you in any way? Do you ever find yourself stuck? Maybe your family is stuck. Maybe your relationship circle. Maybe you're stuck. You've got patterns. You've got habits. You've got ways of living that they aren't always healthy or they aren't always helpful, right? And you find yourself wanting there to be change, maybe, hoping there can be change, but always retreating, always falling back into your patterns. Maybe in your family, it's something like we never talk about hard things, right? Or we never express emotion, or we use our emotions to manipulate others. Maybe there's anger. Maybe there's violence in your family. Maybe there's just an unwillingness to love, to be tender. Families sometimes get stuck this way. Well, the story is going to continue like this. In fact, what happens is the brothers, they finally go home with their grain, one of them left behind in jail. And eventually, they do come back. Not right away. It takes them a while, but eventually, they come back to Egypt. And they've got Benjamin, their little brother, the youngest brother, with them. Because the ruler of Egypt said, "You won't see your other brother unless you bring Benjamin here." And so they do. And this family gets this opportunity at this point in the story. They actually have a chance to experience something new. There's just a moment of hope. There's a little opportunity for them to break out of their cycle of deception and revenge and power and the way that they work. There's a moment that happens, and it happens when Joseph finally lays eyes on his brother Benjamin. Notice what it says when he sees him. It says, deeply moved at the sight of his brother, Joseph hurried out and he looked for a place to weep. He went into his private room and he wept there. He was deeply moved at the sight of his brother. It's deep. It's passionate. There's something about family that wells up in Joseph, and he's thinking maybe there's a chance for family. You see, Benjamin was special to Joseph really for a couple of reasons. For one thing, they are sons of the same mother. And there's no easy way to say this other than their mom was Dad's favorite wife, right? The other 10 brothers, they had different moms. And so there was this division, there was this separation in the family. And also Benjamin was young, he was little. He wasn't a part of the plot to kill Joseph and then eventually to sell him as a slave. And so when Joseph sees him, there's this moment, there's this opportunity, there's this hope. But as quickly as it emerges, it's snuffed out. It vanishes. What Joseph does is he changes his plan. He decides that what he really wants is to keep Benjamin with him. And so he orchestrates this plot to get Benjamin to stay with him. And it's a little bit twisted. I'm not going to lie. It's kind of strange. What he does is he plants some of his property in Benjamin's luggage. And then he sends them all home. And when they're traveling, he sends his security guy to arrest them and say, hey, something's been stolen. And they drag them all back to the palace. And when they get there, they go through the luggage, and sure enough, in Benjamin's bag is the stolen property. And this is all Joseph's attempt to say, okay, this is how Benjamin stays with me. Because what happens is the brothers, at this point, they sort of give up. Right? They're trapped in this cycle of guilt and retribution. We did something really bad a long time ago, and so something really bad's going to happen to us. What goes around comes around. And so here we are. I guess we're just going to end up being slaves. And Joseph, to his credit, he says, no, I wouldn't do that. The only person who has to stay is the one who stole the property, Benjamin. He's got to stay. The rest of you can go. And you can imagine in this moment, right, where there had been this hope, suddenly they're right back in their cycle. They're right back in their pattern of the way things happen in this family. Maybe you've experienced something like that. Right? Maybe in your relationship. Maybe in your family there's been a moment, there's been a chance, maybe some honest conversation that came up and you hoped this could be different, but it wasn't enough. Or maybe someone finally admitting, I think I need help with this thing that I'm struggling with, right? Maybe there was a promise, or maybe there was a vow, it'll be better, it'll be different. But inevitably, you just went back to your old patterns. That's what's happening in this family. But it's at this moment when Benjamin has to stay now enslaved to the ruler of Egypt, and the family goes home, that Judah, who's one of the brothers, he sort of decides, this is it. I've had it. I just can't live like this anymore. And he's real sincere, but he's locked into this guilt and retribution cycle. And he makes this really long speech. And the gist of it is, you know what? I'm ready to take my lumps for what I've done. I'm ready to bear the blame for the things that I'm guilty of. And he begins to talk about the pain that's going to come to his family if Benjamin doesn't return home. It's really interesting. Here's how the speech ends. These are the last couple of verses of Judah's speech. He says this, now then, please let your servant remain. He's talking about himself. Please let your servant remain here as my Lord's slave in place of the boy. Let the boy return with his brothers. How can I go back to my father if the boy is not with me? No, do not let me see the misery that would come on my father. That's Judah saying, I just can't live like this anymore. I deserve punishment. My past has caught up with me, and I'm ready to break that cycle. So keep me and send Benjamin home. And there's something that happens in Judah's speech that's remarkable. If you looked at chapter 45, verse 1, it's the moment when Joseph loses it. He completely loses it. This is what it says. Then Joseph could no longer control himself before all his attendants. And he cried out, have everyone leave my presence. And so there was no one with Joseph when he made himself known to his brothers. Joseph decides, it's time for me to show them who I am, right? He's lost control. This might be the most important verse in the entire story. When Joseph gives up control, he loses control because something's going to happen. And you can imagine perhaps what Joseph's thinking, right? He's thinking, really? Really? Now you care about one of your brothers? Now you'll stick up for your brother? Now you care about what happens to your father? What about me, Judah? What about 20 years ago when you stuck me in that pit and I begged for my life and you left me? He's lost it. And I think his brothers thought that's what he was thinking too, because notice how they respond to this in verse 3. In verse 3, Joseph says to his brothers, I am Joseph. Is my father still living? But his brothers were not able to answer him because they were terrified at his presence. They are terrified, and rightly so, right? This is the worst nightmare. This is their worst scenario come to life. The brother that they sold into slavery now has power over their lives. And so they're quaking, and Joseph says to them, come close to me. And when they had done so, he says, I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. And then something amazing happens. And now, Joseph says, do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. Now, this does not compute with what Joseph's been doing this whole time, right? I mean, Joseph has been getting revenge. He has been making their lives hard. In prison, out of prison, bring your brother, this one stays. He's deceiving them the whole time. And all of a sudden, it's like Joseph has this understanding for the very first time. He hasn't been talking this way the whole story. All of a sudden, he recognizes something. And that something is God. That something is that God has been at work in his life this entire time. Throughout his up and down journey, from slavery to prison to the palace, God has been at work. And what God has been doing is keeping his promise. He's been fulfilling his promise to Joseph and to this family. Notice what he goes on and says in verse 6. For 2 years now, there's been famine in the land, and for the next 5 years, there'll be no plowing and reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. Suddenly, he recognizes that God is at work and God is doing something. So then, he says, it was not you who sent me here, but God. It was not you who sent me here, but God. He made me father to Pharaoh, Lord of his entire household, ruler of all Egypt. It was God all along. He was the one orchestrating, working in and through all of the events, especially the events that Joseph thought, why is this happening in my life? You see, if Joseph doesn't get sold and become a slave, he doesn't end up in the house of Potiphar. And if he doesn't end up in the house of Potiphar, he doesn't get accused of something he didn't do and get thrown into prison. And if Joseph doesn't go to prison, he doesn't meet Pharaoh's cupbearer, who has a dream one night that Joseph interprets. And if Joseph doesn't interpret the cupbearer's dream, later when the cupbearer's back with the Pharaoh and Pharaoh needs someone to interpret a dream, there'd be no one to say, I know this guy Joseph. And if Joseph doesn't interpret Pharaoh's dream, he doesn't become the ruler of Egypt with the plan to survive the famine. And if there's not a plan to survive the famine, this family dies. And suddenly, in this awakening, Joseph recognizes something about God, and that's that he's been there. He's been working. He's been moving. He's been keeping his promise. And so in this amazing moment, this family experiences something completely new. Right? This is an extremely passionate and gracious act on Joseph's part. He in a moment's time redefines what's happening. You think you're headed for prison, but you're not. What's happening now in this moment is our family is being reconnected. The past that you've lived with, this guilt for more than 20 years, it no longer matters. It's negated. And your future, it's open. If you finished reading the passage, you'd find that he says to them, you can come and live here. In fact, you can live in the very, very best part of the land. Your family will thrive. And in doing so, God not only keeps his promise to Joseph, his promise was, yeah, you will rule over your brothers. But not for yourself, not for your glory, not for your revenge, to save their lives. And so he's kept that promise to Joseph. He's also kept a bigger promise to this family. Joseph happens to be the great-grandson of Abraham. Abraham's the man that God says, I'm going to make you a great nation. If this family doesn't survive the famine, God's promise isn't kept to them. And God says that through this family, through Abraham's family, he's going to bless the whole world. And so God keeps his promise. Listen, I want you to hear three things about God. The first is this: God's promises prevail. God's promises are something you can count on. If God makes a promise, he's going to keep it. God's promises aren't sidetracked, they aren't altered, they aren't ruined by even the darkest, most sordid actions and planning of human beings. In a marvelous and mysterious way, God works in, he works with, he works through all of the actions, all of the activities of our lives. And God accomplishes his purposes, even when it doesn't look like it. And the message of this story, one of the messages of this story, is that you can trust God. This is a foundational story for the people of Israel, but also for people of faith throughout the centuries. It's this basic premise that you can trust God. He will keep his promises, and his promises for you are good. They're gracious. They're life-giving. And God's made promises to you. It was Jesus who said, I will be with you always to the end of the age. It was Jesus who said, listen, if I go away, I go to prepare a place for you. I wouldn't say if it's not true. It's the New Testament that says, if any person is in Christ, believes Christ, follows Christ, trusts Christ, They are new. Everything can be new. Because that's the second thing I want you to see about God today. And that is that God's power brings new life. The fact that God is uniquely powerful and able to keep His promises, despite the ups and downs and in and outs and the fickleness of the human heart, it means that God uniquely has the power to bring a new future, a new life right into the middle of what seems stuck. Your life is not chained to your past. Your present that feels stuck is not all that's left for you. Your future that seems uncertain, God has in His plan for you. You see, the story of Joseph, it mirrors, it points us to the most lavish, the most passionate act of grace that brings salvation. And that's the life, the death, and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. That's what Jesus does. He pays the penalty for your sin, for my sin. He defeats the power of death. He unchains you from your past. He makes a new life, a new reality possible. Maybe you're a person like these brothers who lives your life just with this sense of guilt. Like, I've done some stuff. I can't ever pay it back. My life is just about karma and payback. That's all it is. Or maybe your past is full of trauma and difficulty and pain caused by someone else. I want you to see that through Jesus, your life can be made new. If you'll trust Him, if you'll have confidence in Him, if you'll believe in Him, you can experience new life. Because when Jesus rises from the dead, He defeats the power of sin. He unchains us from the pain of our past. And He offers to give us His life, His new life, His unending, amazing, all-encompassing love. It begins to find its way into our hearts and to transform and to redeem everything in our lives. And that creates for us a very new future. A future that, like I've said, is not chained to your past. A future that rests in God. And so this is an invitation today to trust God. You can trust Him. You can trust Him to make good on His promises. You can have confidence in Him today. And you can surrender yourself to His offer of new life. And when we say surrender, we don't mean just give up. We mean to open up. Open up your life to the possibility of redemption, of forgiveness, of hope, and of freedom. That's what God wants for you. It's what He wanted for that family. And He accomplished it through a very passionate, very gracious act that brought them salvation. And He's done it for you in the person of Jesus. The worship team is going to come back and lead us in a song that embodies this message, that your God is able to make a way for you. It doesn't depend on your ability. It doesn't depend on your performance. It doesn't depend on your striving and your accomplishment. It depends on His love for you. Will you pray with me today? Jesus, this morning we want to come. We want to open ourselves to the possibility of life. Even for those of us who've come to church for a long time, we sometimes get lost. We sometimes get trapped into a cycle of trying to pay back things we can never pay back, or trying to accomplish and achieve things that simply don't matter to you because of your grace. And for some of us, it's hard to see a way forward. And so we come to you in trust. Be the way maker for us. And we give you our hearts. And we pray this in Christ's name.